All right, hey y'all, welcome back. This is going to be chapter 5, lecture 5, which is chapter 4, State Institutions and Public Policy. We are going to skip sections 1 and 2. I'm going to jump right into section 3 and talk about the three branches of government. The first is the presidency, which is, as we've discussed, the most important in Latin America. So you've got a lot of different roles. They are not only the chief executive, but the commander in chief and the head of state, just like in the United States. They do tend to have more powers than in the United States. A lot of people think these are a little bit more extreme. Um, they can, in many countries, declare quote unquote emergency, right? And suspend the Constitution. So this would be like Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, suspending the Constitution and suspending habeas corpus, right? Many of them also get the ability to rule by decree. So it's sort of like an executive order, but much more powerful. In the United States, executive orders are basically where the president can sort of order the administration to implement laws that already exist in a particular way, right? And so it's not all that powerful. Like a president can't just make a whole new law, right? He can nuance the rules, right, that already exist, but he can't really make a whole new law. Whereas many South American or Latin American dictators, not even dictators, democratic presidents, what we're talking about, many of them have the ability to sort of rule by fiat, right? Um, they can actually create a law. And so this is why many researchers, at least in political science, tend to suggest that Latin America has what's called hyper presidentialism. There's a much more sort of centralization and executive branch control in Latin America. There's more cronyism, as we've talked about. You can just sort of put in your political appointees into all kinds of sort of administrative positions. Uh, and they're usually in charge of not only the government, but also a particular political party, um, the party system, party nominations, party lists, payouts and bribes, and lots more, right? And there are real concerns in South America, as we've talked about, with constitutionalism. There are still concerns with presidents not following the constitutional law or following judicial rulings, such as like Evo Morales, right? Or Jair Bolsonaro, who was recently banned from running again for a while. Some of these presidents really take advantage of their control and are like, to hell with checks and balances, to hell with the legislature, to hell with the judiciary, and to hell with the Constitution. I'm just going to do whatever I want, right? And then a lot of them push term limits. There are term limits in almost, I believe, every single constitution in Latin America, but many of them sort of ignore the rules, right? So again, Evo Morales would be an example. Okay, the second, of course, is legislatures. So almost all of the legislatures in Latin America are bicameral. That means two houses. You usually have a House of Representatives and a Senate, or a Chamber of Deputies and a Senate, whatever you want to call it. Almost all are elected through PR systems. Mexico is a good exception. Mexico uses SMD system or first past the post, plurality, whatever you want to call it. They are largely subservient to the president. They A lot of times there's so much gridlock because there's so few parties that basically governing and legislating falls to the president, and the sort of legislature takes the advice and consent role. So they're more in a secondary position, right? You got the president on top, as we talked about, and then you have sort of the administration, the legislature, the courts underneath the president instead of sort of co equal with the president. Legislatures are, however, growing in power. Um, Due to the sort of personalistic systems and the nature of many of these systems that we've talked about before, where candidates are very personalistic centric instead of party centric, there's a lot more candidate control rather than party control, right? And so there's a lot of intra-party fighting, which can be really problematic. Let's see. The legislature and the court sort of ousted Dilma Rousseff in 2016 for the car wash corruption scandal in Brazil. So this is just an example of sort of legislatures growing in power a little bit more. Section 3, of course, is the courts. So these are, again, not often separate or co equal. These are often filled with cronies of the president's administration. Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, Cuba, all of those are really problematic. El Salvador, and are tools of the presidency rather than being a sort of separate and co equal branch. Some courts, however, especially in the more major powers in Latin America, are trying to exert some control. So you're seeing more of this in Brazil, you're seeing more in Uruguay, Argentina, and Colombia. And they're generally growing in power and trying to assert co equal status, though there has been some backward movement, like I said, in the Central Corridor countries, in Venezuela, and even arguably in Mexico. Okay, Section 4 is based on regional and local governments. So most of these governments are at least pseudo federalistic. They tend to be increasing in importance, right? Especially in some of the major states like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, and especially in major, areas with major cities, major urban populations, right? As urbanization increases, they're growing in power, as we talked about in one of the former chapters. Central governments are still most powerful. Now, I'm not saying these federal governments are like co-equal, like they are in the United States, where like Texas has a huge hand in making their own actual legislation, but they are growing in power over time. And then I would also point out that, like I pointed out before, many of the interior regions are still, quote unquote, wild or unenforced or, undeveloped, whatever you want to talk about. And so the governments don't even really exist there, right? So you're talking about like the Brazilian jungle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, parts of Colombia, um, and this is where you get sort of the rise of guerrillas, revolutionaries, drug traffickers, Marxists, etc. Okay, then you have what they call the sort of fourth branch of government. This is the autonomous state agencies. So, as we learned about a little with the economic history, this became very important from like the 60s to the 90s, maybe the 50s to the 90s, when they're borrowing a lot. They have these really bloated bureaucracies. And so you get this really powerful autonomous state agency problem. And so these agencies have great control and really start to take over sort of post 80s democratization, right? When the military is no longer in control. And so some of these agents have remarkable control, like price controls, like they'll put price limits on bread, on steel, on whatever, and then the government will have to come up with the rest. Hiring, firing, contracts and contract negotiations, and which companies are going to get to build infrastructure, etc. They get to make their own regulations. So this is sort of like the FDA, right? Or like the EPA in America. Uh, Again, many of these countries own massive state industries, oil industries, communications industries, telecommunications industries, energy companies, utilities, water, all of these things, in which these sort of state agencies are all involved. We also talked about the massive, massive public payrolls, where like 40 to 60% of all GNP in a nation was based on public service jobs. And many of these were incredibly inefficient because they had been filled up with cronies and corrupt, vote buying practices, things like that. Um, so this is what the Mexico looked like until the mid '90s under the PRI, which is a really good example of this. Brazil during sort of the late '80s is a good example. Venezuela after Hugo Chavez, and now under Maduro. Um, much of the Central Corridor, and then it also caused massive debt problems, right? In Mexico, in Argentina, in Chile, in Peru, where their entire currencies collapsed. You saw capital flight from the country. I mean, it caused extreme problems and led to the neoliberal policies of the 90s. Okay, Section 5 is public policy today. Many of these policies were reformed. They were a lot more leftist during sort of the 50s to 90s, and many were reformed after the debt crises, right, of the 70s to the 90s. A lot of these reforms, as we've talked about, were pushed by the U.S. and the IMF and the World Bank, and was known as sort of neoliberalization or the Washington Consensus. You get privatization of companies and assets, right? Sell them off and let them be run by the market. You have austerity and reduction in poverty, right? Reduction programs. So a lot of these countries sort of cut their poverty reduction programs, though there are some really good exceptions that we'll talk about. There's you get sort of a sweeping out of bureaucracy, right? Like they had to completely shrink their bureaucracy in many of these countries: Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, etc. Um, some of these countries have held on to their sort of national industries, but most of them sold them off. So Mexico kept Pemex. Brazil, I believe, still has some nationalized countries. Venezuela, obviously, with their oil industry, but most of them were sold off. And then you've also had the recent rise of what's called the cash transfer systems, the CCTs. And so you saw this really started in Brazil and Mexico, and now it's sort of exploding all over South America, and in India and in Asia, where if you qualify, like you're one of the very poor or rural or whatever, you'll get a small payment from the government onto like a card, like a food stamp card, or it's just basically a cash card that you have to have on you that's issued by the government. Um, and what they do is, so long as your children attend school, and so long as you personally and your children make their like annual medical checkup and get their vaccinations or whatever it is, then you'll get, say, a $50 payment every month, right? And this has reduced poverty remarkably in Latin America. Like we talked about earlier, it went from anywhere from like 25% of extreme poverty to now around 9% and shrinking. It caused huge increases in education, right? Because families were no longer having to pull their children from school to do work, whether in the real market like agriculture or whether in the sort of shadow market, right? Drugs or just selling knickknacks on the street or whatever it is. They increased vaccination rates remarkably and are starting to really get rid of some of these major diseases in their countries. They've made major advances in healthcare and sort of long-term health, right? Because they're focusing on like yearly annual checkups. So they've done some really great things with these, and we've seen this spread all over. Um, and like I said, it's spread to India, Asia, and others. Okay, yeah, not bad. 13 minutes. Thank you so much for being here. That was lecture 5, chapter 4, and I'll get the next one up soon. Have a great day. Bye.